For much of the 18th century, the Maratha Empire was the ascendant power of Hindustan. By force of arms, they had conquered nearly an entire subcontinent. Their guns were powerful, their cavalry quick, their coffers brimmed with wealth. And I hear that they were great at spontaneous synchronized dance sequences as well. Yet in the new century, after only 2 brief wars, that dominion would almost completely collapse, losing most of their territory not to a rival country power, but to a foreign corporation. The story of the Anglo-Maratha Wars are dominated by stories of British military triumph. After all, it was not at Waterloo that Arthur Wellesley said he'd won his greatest victory, it was at Assaye. But what we don't often hear about is the other side, the native side, the men who resisted the East India Company and how they did so. To understand the British conquest of India, you need to understand the armies of Hindustan itself. So in this video, I'm going to start by looking at some of the broader themes of the Maratha military before going into the specifics of the army's different wings. As always, this video is only scratching the surface, so if you're interested in pursuing deeper research, well then all of the sources and some additional readings as well will all be listed below, many of which you can access free of charge at nativeoak.org/library. With that, let us begin with the decline of the Maratha Empire. It's ironic that this video begins at something of an end, but the fall of the Maratha was not a quick or even a linear process, nor did it begin with the outbreak of hostilities with the East India Company. In fact, the first war between them, which was fought in years that might look familiar to you, was a Maratha victory. It was only the latter 2 wars that would spell their doom. And if you're interested in learning about the empire's earlier days, when they conquered most of India, well then I'll link a few short videos for you to watch in the description down below that will go over that history, at least in brief. But for our purposes, throughout the latter days of the 18th century, after those conquests have all concluded, that's all history now, the Maratha were slowly losing their cohesion. Their military authority was in a state of decline. As the size of the empire grew, so too, of course, did the costs of maintaining and defending that empire. Imperial authority began to disperse to more localized rulers who could see after their own affairs. And over time, even the Chhatrapati himself— oh, incidentally, a lot of Hindi words in this video, probably a lot of mispronunciation, get ready for it. But in any case, even the Chhatrapati himself, the Maratha king or emperor, however you want to, translate the word, became more and more of a ceremonial figure, with that power passing over to their Peshwa, basically a prime minister, although later on, as I understand it, even that position became basically hereditary. So naturally, this also meant a decline in the central military power, as the obligations of providing soldiers and the like dissolved to those local rulers who provided peasant levies, and of increasing significance throughout the time period, they would provide foreign mercenaries to the feudal confederacy's army. Alongside, there was still a small core professional force of the Peshwa himself, the professional army of the Peshwa. As one Maratha cavalry officer in the employ of the influential Holkar family would record, every Raja, prince, or leader is responsible among the Marathas to the Peshwa, or head of the empire, for his general conduct. He pays tribute for his district and attends when summoned with his quota of men, which is regulated by his wealth and population. He is supreme in command over his corps, which is attached alone to him and to his fortunes, and adheres to whatever party he supports. These mercenary forces were ethnically diverse and came with a wide variety of national, religious, and, where applicable, caste backgrounds. And so throughout the 18th century, as European armies were becoming more centralized, the Maratha military became less and less Maratha. As Major R.L. Ambrose would comment, this also meant that there was little to no patriotic sentiment within the soldiery. Instead, soldiering was more of a trade than a career, and a warrior was only truly loyal to the one who paid his salary. There are in that country many hundreds of thousands, soldiers by profession, who wander continually from service to service, from prince to prince, as the pressure of the moment requires their assistance and promises them employ. Gain is their god, and it is so perfectly immaterial to them whom they serve while they are paid, and the minutiae of their caste attended to, that an utter stranger with efficient funds might at any time raise an army in Hindustan who would follow him and fight his battles as long as his resources were sufficient for the current expenses of the day. Born soldiers, without any other profession than that of arms, these men eagerly flocked to the standard of any adventurer, however desperate his prospects, if he only possesses the summum bonum of their happiness. In the minds of these people, no such sentiment as amor patria is to be found, above affection for a few clods of earth or stumps of trees, merely from having been imprinted on their recollection from the sportive period of infancy. The Indian is, in this point, a citizen of the world. It not infrequently happens that fathers, sons, and brothers embrace different services, and meet in battle array on ensanguined plain against each other, perhaps unwittingly to fall by each other's hands. Perhaps a little dramatic, but it gets the point across, I think. And included in the ranks of these mercenaries were Afghans, Arabs, even Europeans, alongside plenty of others. It wasn't just Indians from other parts of the subcontinent. And those European mercenaries in particular the officers, they represent another major element of the Maratha army of this time. Because it wasn't all just a story of decline, of moving backwards. Even as the Marathas are relying on those mercenaries, they were modernizing their military, both its structure as well as its drill and equipment, so that while the armies of Hindustan were arguably not at their absolute height when they met the EIC in battle, their story was not a one of linear decay. And this interesting dichotomy, I think, brings us to the first element of the army, which I'd like to discuss: the Maratha Infantry. And their extra wallets. After all, they're the ones who sponsored the video, so I should probably talk about them. By this point, I imagine you've heard plenty about the extra wallet from my channel, about how the British Army would regularly use them during the Napoleonic Wars because of the clear advantage the quick card access button would allow them. I have long espoused on the advantages, when on a hard campaign, of the wallet's ability to carry some 12 cards plus cash while maintaining a sleek and modern design, far more effective than an old bifold. The extra wallets would also often change in color based on the regiment, yes, to which they were issued, of course. But what I haven't discussed is the use of the extra wallets abroad in the Empire, and particularly the use of the special Parliament Saffiano design. See, while the regular Parliament wallet was a standard issue in Europe, company troops in India would often go for this more stylized approach, which you can see here in this fine and distinctive texture which sets the Saffiano apart from the others. Soon enough, the Maratha began using it as well, and it became a common sight all across Hindustan from approximately 1757 to 1823, which is actually quite surprising as well, quite strange, seeing as how the Saffiano was only recently released and is now available for sale. Find out more by visiting the link in the description, where you'll also get a lovely discount for up to 25% off your order. Thank you as ever to Exeter for their sponsorship, and now on to the Maratha Infantry. The basis of almost all European military operations through history have been foot soldiers, and you might always expect them to represent the vast majority of troops on any given field. But that wasn't necessarily the case in India. Now, in earlier Maratha history, yes, they relied on a strong, large corps of infantry. But as the Confederacy secured its home territories and her borders became more fixed rather than constantly shifting, the army's need for outright conquest and garrisoning recently conquered territory would decline. Eventually, the Maratha became more concerned with carrying war into their enemies' lands, and in these distant expeditions, designed mainly for plunder, a cavalry force was far more useful than infantry. In a Portuguese report dated June 1787, therefore, we read that the Peshwa could bring into the field 80 to 100,000 horse, 10,000 foot, and 40 to 50 pieces of artillery. And believe it or not, some sources wouldn't bother mentioning the infantry at all because, at least in comparison to the cavalry, it simply wasn't as relevant. Gradually, the focus of the Maratha military infrastructure shifted to being dominated by cavalry, and especially lighter cavalry designed to raid enemy supply lines and villages for loot, more so than actually engaging enemy armies in pitched combat, but we'll come to that later on in the video. And so there rose a sentiment that the Maratha themselves would never enlist with such dirty work as infantry service. That's a very broad generalization, but there's a general idea that the Marathas themselves aren't doing the infantry service. The infantry is there to occupy territory. They're there to suppress revolts. For a man to really win fame and fortune for himself, he's going to go and join the cavalry, go on those raids, which is where the real money, the real loot is coming in. And thus, the need for those infantry forces to, have sufficient numbers of them, they're going to be made up almost entirely at some points by foreign mercenaries. But, funnily enough, that reliance on foreigners would both weaken, naturally, and it would also strengthen that core, as many of those men, again, particularly the officers, were Europeans who could help to modernize that force simultaneously. Experienced white officers were highly valued men in India, and they quickly found themselves in all sorts of prestigious and powerful positions within Maratha society, both militarily and otherwise, and whether it was deserved or not. And you'll see that influence throughout the remainder of this video. Under men like Benoit de Boyne, a nobleman and veteran from Savoy who was really important in these modernizing efforts, they would begin recruiting, drilling, and outfitting their sepoys, or their soldiers, according to European standards. And depending on the officer, the men might look and act either like French or British soldiers, because it would all typically vary based on their commander's individual preference. It was a modernization program, but for a large part, it wasn't a centralized modernization program. In earlier days, the various Maratha armies didn't actually have any formal uniform, not even in the European-style corps. They didn't have a central kit, so to say. It isn't like the concept itself of uniformity didn't exist in India. The Mughals had used certain uniform patterns much, much earlier. It's more a matter of the infrastructure just not really being there. If these are all mercenary soldiers, it's largely going to fall onto their individual leader as opposed to the government to supply them, so why pay extra to have them all look fancy if it's not going to have a direct impact on their job? That's one perspective on it, at least, although eventually that perspective does die out. Just the infrastructure wasn't really there. It was only in the 1750s that we start to see commanding officers actually spending that necessary money to give uniforms to their soldiers, and even then it wasn't actually consistent. It would depend, again, on the taste of the individual leaders, with their kits taking influence from either French uniforms, British uniforms, and country fashion, which is to say native military fashions. We don't have a lot of documentation for what these soldiers looked like, but there is evidence that coats were very commonly of either red or blue cloth. We're not sure if they would have different colored facings or not, based on the battalions. Although what we do know about is the common wearing of short drawers, which is definitely, I think, the most distinctive part of the sepoy's appearance, as well as some different colors and different styles of turban. It was only in 1765 that the East India Company would establish a uniform of its own, and the fashion of the Maratha military largely followed suit after that. So that by the time of the Second and Third Anglo-Maratha Wars, both sides were outfitted, equipped, and even drilled in very much the same fashion. They looked pretty much alike. One of the few exceptions to that basic rule of the EIC and Maratha troops more or less looking the same was that the Maratha would often wear swords alongside using bayonets. And even European officers of native corps on both sides of that affair would often dress and outfit themselves in these rather exotic-looking but thoroughly practical sort of hodgepodge mixtures of both foreign, European, and country, Indian styles. We even have a few accounts, actually, of European officers wearing Indian armor and carrying shields and all sorts of things like that, which you really don't see over in Europe, of course. As Andy Copestake wrote in his excellent book, which unfortunately I don't have a physical copy of, but it's referenced down below, it seems that for senior officers, almost any kind of costume was allowable, so long as it did not interfere with their duties. Personal taste was everything. So on the whole, by 1802, at least the smaller corps of professional soldiers under the Peshwa, called the Gardi, were a well-drilled and comparatively well-disciplined force, according to more or less European standards. But they were also very limited in their numbers overall, and the Marathas were always having to compete with the EIC to recruit the best troops, to say nothing of their difficulties in keeping the men supplied. One British officer would write of the Peshwa's personal infantry in 1794. "They are in general so contemptible as soldiers that they hardly deserve notice. The best of them are called Gardis, of whom there are 5,000 or 6,000. Their coats are of red serge, with a blue collar and cuff, cut in the country taste. Their arms, it is true, are for the most part English. And out of 20, 2 will be found without locks, 6 without cocks, and perhaps not a flint amongst the remaining 12. Their discipline is much the same as their appearance. In addition to the musket, most of the Gardis carry a sword or a pistol, and such as have bayonets keep them constantly fixed, which, as well as having a more warlike appearance, saves them the encumbrance of a scabbard and belt." So again, maybe a little extreme there, but a good example from the times. But still, even with all of that, supply issues were hardly going to be the worst of the Marathas' problems. Like I've said, the Hindu army was relying massively on foreign volunteers, and especially European officers to train them. But as well, there weren't too many of them. Typically, for every native brigade of some 800 soldiers, there might only be 3 or so European officers, and the remainder of the command structure were all going to be native NCOs. And these officers were coming from all over the place, too. It wasn't very common that you have, like, a single corps of infantry with all English or all French officers. As one of them would comment in 1798, "As for the officers of our regular infantry, we had them of all nations, French, English, Germans, Portuguese, and country-born of English fathers." And these different nationalities would lead to complications within individual corps. Englishmen and Frenchmen especially would refuse to cooperate with one another, and sometimes both governments would actually encourage their own officers to seek employment within these native militaries, not as a way to aid their native allies, it's as a way to counter the other side's influence within those native armies. It's basically a great game of imperial espionage being played out in another country's army. And that isn't a great topic for a spy film. I don't even know what would be. But even if these European officers as well weren't ordered into the native armies, even if they didn't have like nefarious purposes right from the outset, there was always the option as well of selling military secrets to European governments for an easy and a rather lucrative payout. By the late 18th century, the Maratha government had very few secrets. But perhaps most damning of all for the Confederacy was that sometimes Europeans would just outright refuse, if the situation arose, to fight their own countrymen. At the very start of the Second Anglo-Maratha War, British officials outright decreed that any Briton who took up arms against their forces would unsurprisingly not be welcome back home. The result of that being that at the worst possible time, at the beginning of a war, massive swaths of the Confederacy's officer corps were resigning, defecting, or surrendering at the soonest opportunity. Their entire military infrastructure was basically gutted overnight without firing a shot. There are still NCOs, of course, who can sort of take up those jobs and fill in those roles, but there's going to be a very negative impact if you just lose all your officers overnight. The Maratha authorities, they weren't very good at identifying the conflicting interests among their hired Europeans, those interests which were born out of cultural and political differences, their other mercenaries, they don't share the sense of patriotism or the desire to fight beyond the job description, like we saw earlier. So at the end of the day, the story of the Maratha Infantry was something of a mixed bag. Despite their myriad problems, they had spent a great deal of the 18th century attempting, in their own way at least, to modernize and professionalize a part of their military which had hitherto been neglected for some time. They definitely weren't at their best, but you can't just write them off, as many contemporaries did, to be fair, as a story of decline. As one British official working at the Maratha court, Lieutenant Colonel John Collins, would warn Arthur Wellesley prior to the Second War, "Their infantry and guns will astonish you." And so would the future Duke of Wellington discover in the trying days ahead, even if he didn't believe it at the time. But we are not here today to discuss the Second Anglo-Maratha War, where he made such a great reputation for himself, so let's move on instead to the second arm of Hindustani soldiering, the mighty and the powerful guns of the Maratha Artillery. Once again, the story here is an interesting and a complicated one, which could change a lot depending on exactly when and how you're looking at it. As usual, we're going to focus on the late 18th century, by which point the Maratha Artillery held a long and a very deeply honored role within the Maratha military. It wasn't a European introduction to Eastern warfare either. There had been cannon foundries all across India for centuries by this point, and they produced guns of, not to harp on the term, but of astonishing quality. As Joshua Provan says in his book Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira, even the Woolwich arsenal envied the precision and the excellence of the Indian guns and would recommend adopting models based on their strength and lightness, and that the British were in awe of the power of the Maratha artillery and regularly heard that the enemy counted on this arm more than any other to win battles against them. And by lightness here, he means relative to their size, as many of the guns, as you'll see, could get quite large. But despite this great faith in the great guns, the Maratha artillery was not without its problems, some of which hearkened to the same issues with their infantry, and which would ultimately cripple the force when push came to shove against the East India Company. Yes, the barrels of those guns were excellently made, but their carriages were not. They were often crudely constructed, difficult to move and maneuver. The majority of artillery in India, in fact all of it pretty much until the late 18th century, was pulled not by quick horses, but much slower oxen and pushed by elephants. So too was the Maratha artillery drill outdated and slow, and the combination of all of these factors meant that their accuracy was very poor as well. As one account of the Third Battle of Panipat between the Marathas and Afghans would describe, Maratha guns being very large and heavy, and their level not easily altered, their shot began to pass over our troops, and fell a mile in the rear. And this inefficiency on the battlefield wasn't all, either. Despite the highly honored, almost reverential position which many of these old, large guns would hold, as you would expect, they were also very expensive, very difficult to maintain, especially for a military apparatus which was becoming less centralized. As one eyewitness to the once great Maratha artillery would describe, "The park of artillery, where all their guns are collected, made an extraordinary appearance. The gun carriages, in which they trust to the solidity of the timber and use but little iron in their construction, are clumsy beyond belief, particularly the wheels, which are low and formed by large, solid pieces of wood united. The guns are of all sorts and dimensions, and having the names of their gods given to them, are painted in the most fantastic manner, and many of them, held in esteem for their services they are said to have already performed for the state, cannot be dispensed with, although in every respect unfit for use. Were the guns even serviceable, the small supply of ammunition with which they are provided has always effectively prevented the Maratha artillery from being formidable to their enemies." The core advantage of the Maratha artillery, then, seems to have been the sheer numbers of guns which they could bring to bear. In nearly every battle from the Anglo-Maratha Wars, you'll see that disparity in numbers right away. But you'll also see that oftentimes, no matter how many guns they have, they're going to prove very little effect against the smaller numbers of much lighter European cannon, which were capable of firing and maneuvering very quickly across the battlefield. After all, the basic principle is that 118-pounders that miss their mark could never prove so effective as 10 3-pounders that find it. But here as well, much like the infantry, the Maratha were not totally resting on their laurels, and efforts were made to modernize. A benefit of the complicated network of Maratha foundries was that they were capable of producing all sorts of guns, including lighter and more versatile pieces. And by the late 18th century, we do start to see a greater degree of these faster-moving batteries, which were largely being crewed either by hired Europeans or by individuals trained in European fashion, and again, they're being drilled to European standard. Although, as we saw before, again, that's going to bring its own set of problems as well, having so much European influence, but we see the efforts there being made. It might also be worth noting that besides these traditional elements, the Maratha were making use of a variety of more unique sorts of artillery as well, although, to be fair, they never really had a very great effect, especially not against European forces. I just mean to say that not all the Maratha artillery were these big lumbering guns that could hardly be maneuvered. The Maratha understood the need for versatility, it simply wasn't the most practical form of it when they met the European form, if that makes sense. For example, while the Maratha would never fix swivel guns onto elephants like the Mughals before them would, they would sometimes arm camels with them. They could also employ an equivalent to the wall gun, not just within forts, but fired from the back of a kneeling camel. These camel corps had the potential for great speed, but again, they weren't terribly useful in the field for a wide variety of reasons. Another unique method of war was the usage of war rockets, a weapon of terror manufactured specifically for the Peshwa's army, and which actually saw some more limited use up to the Sepoy Mutiny in the mid-Victorian era. As described by a certain Colonel Wilkes, this Indian instrument receives its projectile force from the same composition which is used in the rockets of ordinary fireworks. The cylinder which contains it is of iron, and sometimes gunpowder at its extremity causes it to explode when it has reached its object. A straight sword blade is also not unfrequently fixed to the rocket. An attached bamboo or reed steadies its flight. The rocketmen are trained to give them an elevation proportioned to the varying dimensions of the cylinder and the distance of the object to be struck. As those projected to any distance describe a parabola of considerable height, a single rocket is easily avoided. But when the flight is numerous, the attempts would be useless, and their momentum is always sufficient to destroy a man or a horse. In earlier days of Indian warfare, when the elephant was the mightiest weapon of war, these rockets could be used to great effect in making the creatures panic and flee. And of course, a well-directed rocket to an enemy's magazine could end a siege pretty quickly. But as time went on, the devices lost a lot of their effectiveness, save for their impact on the morale of country troops. Generally, an Indian soldier was much more afraid of a rocket than of a musket ball, as Muhammad Jafar Shamlu says of Abdali's followers fighting at Panipat. As for a musket ball, the heroes cared not what it might do, and in that scene of carnage and slaughter, the only dread entertained by the renowned and gallant combatants was for a cannonball or the flight of a rocket. So once again, as a whole, the Maratha artillery are a bit of a mixed bag. They have a strong tradition of artillery, some of the finest guns in India, even in the world. Yet, they didn't necessarily know how to use them to their greatest effect, and they were hindered by logistical problems, poor preparedness, and in that way, they were actually rather similar to the infantry. But then what about the third arm of Hindustan, that wing of the military which was most distinctly Maratha and which was feared across the subcontinent? Finally, let us discuss the Maratha Cavalry, which traditionally was the most important and prestigious part of the Confederacy's armies, and on which they leaned the heaviest for much of the 18th century. The Maratha were renowned for their expert horsemanship, both by Indians and foreigners. British commentators would write about how their cavalry were constantly at the beck and call of their expensive mounts, shampooing, which in this case means massaging, them vigorously in order to maintain their musculature and to encourage them to subsist on half the feed that a presidency or king's mount would eat. While in the British cavalry you might expect to see troopers alternate between riding their mounts and leading them on foot in order to preserve their health, the Maratha were able to ride for incredible distances without halting once. The great power he has over the horse with his tackle enables him to turn at 3/4 speed and almost within his own length. It also allows him to ride 60 miles at a stretch without being fatigued. Not one man only, but many a whole regiment of irregular cavalry will do this, although in their ranks are officers and men 70 years of age. I have seen them at the end of a long march, if about to go on foot duty, prefer sitting on their horses to dismounting. Bad walkers as they are, they do not know what fatigue is on horseback. Now that account comes from much later in the Victorian era, but still many of the horsemanship principles would remain much the same. The most iconic weapon of the Maratha cavalry were these 12 to 18 foot long spears, typically made out of either light wood or bamboo with steel heads. Rather than being used like a traditional cavalry lance, they were thrust much like how spears would be on the ground. The Maratha trained in special forms of combat which would allow them to keep their spear tip pointed towards a foe regardless of which direction they came from, dancing to and fro in their saddles regardless of the incredible length of the spear itself. Many of these techniques, both of combat and of more general horsemanship, were practiced through sporting events, which eventually the British military and even the modern sporting world would adopt as well, for example, such as tent pegging. And you can find some footage of a Victorian cavalry group practicing that sport on the YouTube channel Lindy Beige if you want to see it in practice in a more military environment. But again, there is still a modern sport of tent pegging, which is really interesting to see. I'd like to see it in person one of these days. But in any case, while these long spears were a favorite of the Maratha cavalry, they weren't generally standardized. Many of the cavalrymen would be responsible for supplying their own weapons and even their own mounts, although to be fair, that's a pretty common thing over in Europe as well. The following quote is from earlier in the 18th century, so before a lot of these modernizing efforts and reforms are being made, but I think it still applies to the Maratha cavalry. It applies to the entire Maratha military, but I think it applies to the cavalry particularly well here. A Maratha army consists in general of horse and foot of every neighboring nation, religion, and costume. It makes a very motley appearance, as it is under no discipline and destitute of regular uniform. Few of the men in the same line, either cavalry or infantry, have weapons of a like form. Some are armed with sword and shield, others with matchlocks or muskets. Some carry bows and arrows, others spears, lances, or war rockets. Many are expert with the battle axe, but the saber is indispensable to all. The men in armor, of whom there are many to make up the variety, cut a very curious appearance. A helmet covers not only the head and ears, but protects the shoulders. The body is cased in iron network, or in a thick quilted vest. The use of musketry, and especially matchlock musketry. Matchlocks were actually very, very common, both the infantry and the cavalry. The infantry had like special light corps that specifically used matchlocks. They never really modernized it. It was a whole thing. I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty right now, but in any case, the use of musketry on horseback even was a particularly prized skill, with many mounted troops able to, ride really, really close, like 30 yards within of their opponents, before, they drop the reins, take a shot, take the reins back up, and then ride away, all in like one fell swoop. Again, it was something that they would practice in sport, taking shots at bottles and such, for example. So you can expect a pretty fair level of accuracy there. As the quote said as well, the cavalry swords were very, very important. And you might expect to see men armed with talwars, shamshars, scimitars. I cannot comment myself on the use of any of these weapons. For that, in particular, I would recommend a channel, Schola Gladiatoria, who has done a great deal of work on all those subjects. But what I can do is reference the words of another contemporary who would write, "As the Asiatic used it with a drawing cut, no one who has not seen wounds inflicted by when used in this manner can have an idea of the execution performed. I have seen limbs lopped off and gashes given by a light saber and a light arm in a way which might have been deemed impossible even for a giant." Although it is also worthy of note that alongside these variety of fearsome weapons, that in the Maratha cavalry a reluctance to charge will be frequently observed, which does not proceed from any deficiency in personal courage, but from this cause. A great part of the horses in the Maratha service are, we have understood, the property of the riders, who receive a certain monthly pay according to the goodness of the horse, for their own and their beasts' services. If a man has his horse killed or wounded, no equivalent is made him by the Sirkar, but he loses his animal and his allowance. He will therefore, of course, be as careful as possible to preserve both. And as we come to this financial concern, it may be a good time to discuss the different types of Maratha cavalry, because this wasn't a single unitary force. And again, unfortunately for them, throughout the 18th century, it trends towards being a story of decline, because while in earlier Maratha history, cavalry was a force to be reckoned with, by the turn of the century, they were little more than semi-professional brigands. At least a lot of them were. There were 4 main grades of Maratha cavalry. Firstly, the Kaski Paga, pronunciations. These men were the Peshwa's personal force. Think of them as an equivalent to the household cavalry troops. They're like the personal guard regiments, if you will. They were exceptionally well equipped, very well trained, and intensely highly paid for their loyal service to the Peshwa. However, this professional unit of cavalry was also, as you might expect, very, very small. Then you had the Siladar, effectively the main Maratha line cavalry. These are still professional soldiers, but they brought all their own equipment, and they weren't very well paid. They basically relied on a subsistence wage up until the point that they were on campaign. Then, when they're campaigning, they have a right to a share of the enemy loot, which is where they're actually going to expect to get their proper payment. That's where they're making their career, as opposed to just surviving. Then on a very similar note to the Siladar, third comes the Ekandas. Ekandas, I don't know. They were sort of like a yeomanry cavalry force. They were volunteers rather than professional soldiers. These men were the most common of the actual proper cavalry class, and they'd be paid based on the quality of the mount that they brought with them. They also supplied their own weapons and other equipment. So again, they're very similar to the line cavalry, if you will, but just some minor distinctions as far as how they're serving, how they're being paid, how they're equipped, things like that. And then finally, of course, on the periphery of the Maratha cavalry, but still very, very important to their operation and the overall Maratha style of warfare, we have the Pindaris. Now, these men were effectively brigands. They were bandits who weren't actually hired by the state during wartime. They're not like the yeomanry being brought on when needed. They're actually paying the state. The Pindaris are paying for the privilege, a license, if you will, to pillage the enemy's countryside. It's sort of like they're paying for a letter of marque, as if the Pindaris were pirates, but with horses on the Deccan as opposed to ships on the Caribbean. The Pindaris were not a fighting force. They were no more proper cavalry than pirates are a navy. All too often, if they were put to the task of actually fighting a committed opponent, even when they had the advantage, the Pindaris would turn and run, not daring to risk the mounts on which their livelihoods depended. As Joshua Proven describes them, they were a polyglot of professional marauders, coming from all sorts of national and caste backgrounds. And one anonymous writer, dated to 1819, offers a more romantic description of their operations. The climate and hardy habits of these plunderers render tents or baggage an unnecessary encumbrance. Each person carries a few days' provision for himself and for his horse, and they march for weeks together at a rate of 30 and 40 miles a day over roads and countries impassable for a regular army. They exhibit striking resemblance to the Cossacks, as well in their customs as in the activity of their movements. They pillage without distinction, friends as well as foes. And speaking to the decline of the empire's military, as it became increasingly feudal and confederated rather than centralized, by 1780, for every one regular horseman in the Maratha cavalry, there were up to 10 pindaris. An army designed to loot, to raid supply lines, but not to take fields, not to storm fortifications, which is exactly what the Maratha would have needed in their wars against the East India Company. And so we come to our conclusion. In the study of imperial history, whether it's the British in India, the Americans in Vietnam, or the Romans in Gaul, it's incredibly easy, and it's all too common, to suffer the pitfall of focusing so much on the imperial power that we neglect the natives, that we envision their society as primitive, their military as a mindless blob, and their actions, be they political or economic or otherwise, as simple, even dumb. But that simplification of entire cultures, entire state apparatuses, which could become really quite complicated, it's inherently flawed. It prevents you from understanding the complete picture. In this case, the Maratha Empire, while certainly not in its prime by the time of the wars against the East India Company, which would ultimately spell its doom, of course, it was still a massive and a powerful entity with complex military structures, the likes of which this video can only serve as a very brief introduction. They could sustain massive armies, and they had been working throughout the 18th century to modernize their forces in light of an increasingly influential foreign presence. The value of this modernization, this westernization, the Marathas realized it. And ultimately, owing to a great deal of factors, both internal and external, a lot of stuff there, many of these efforts did ultimately fail to achieve the desired results. But even still, despite those failures, there were numerous occasions when Maratha forces would prove a worthy opponent to British and other European arms. It gave them a run for their money quite a few times. They were not some mindless native horde roving across India, as many may imagine, but they had much more in common with the sepoys of the East India Company and the British Army and all that fun stuff than they didn't. To understand the British conquest of India, you need to understand India itself. And if you'd like to continue your learning, well, I'd recommend you to look at this video's description, where not only will you find a variety of recommended videos from other channels that are related to this topic, but also some articles and links to the, for example, the two excellent books that I referenced in this video, as well as a slew of primary sources, which you can read free of charge by visiting nativeoak.org/library. And in particular, I'd like to extend my thanks directly. I shouldn't have put the book down. I'd like to extend my thanks directly to Mr. Joshua Proven of the channel Adventures in Historyland for his assistance in my making this video, as well as the channel Hindustan, which was generous enough to send me a lot of the images that I used in this video, and which honestly can be really quite hard to come by, especially when you can only, search for these Hindu terms in English. It can be hard to find images of exactly what you're looking for. So his sending over some images was very much appreciated. Again, it is all linked down below, so go and continue your educational journey. Thank you for the time that you have spent with me here today, my dear viewer, and until the next time, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.